I am pleased to introduce Anna Kreacic, the partner and chief knowledge officer of Oliver Wyman Group and the chief operating officer of the Oliver Wyman Forum, the firm's think tank. Anna is a change maker who excels at integrating customer insights with business strategy and leadership effectiveness. Her current work delves into evolving human needs and behaviors, particularly how they are influenced by AI and future generations. With 20 years of consulting and operational experience in corporate strategy, organizational effectiveness, and new business ventures, Anna's expertise in developing and leveraging intellectual capital has been instrumental in driving organizational success and innovation. In today's presentation, Anna will discuss the importance of women's leadership and ways to foster key leadership qualities. Please join me in welcoming Anna Kreacic to the stage. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. I realize I'm one session away from your day ending. So we're going to try to make this as fun as possible and as invigorating as possible. Shanique mentioned I'm a partner at Oliver Wyman. I also on a day-to-day basis run our think tank, the Oliver Wyman Forum, which is really our hub for both Oliver Wyman and Marsh McLennan from a thought leadership perspective, as well as bringing together senior leaders across diverse public sector, private sector, academia, et cetera, to solve critical challenges that we're facing. They've never been simple, but they're more complex than ever. So with that, we're going to start macro with State of the World, which is something that I released at the World Economic Forum at Davos this year. There's a lot of disruptions, so as we talk about those disruptions, don't let them get you down, because I actually think there's also a lot of hope in the world. And we're going to talk about what it means for women at work, as well as for women's leadership. And then the next panel is going to delve into some of that with a little bit more detail. Going back to 5 years, part of what I do on a day-to-day basis is I study humans. I study how humans are changing. I look at human insights. What does it mean in terms of what we expect for the world, what we expect for our economies, and what we expect from consumers and employees. And when I remember when COVID first hit, I was sitting in New York, and I couldn't believe that we were running out of toilet paper. I mean, who predicted that we would run out of toilet paper? And as I was talking to people in Europe and the Middle East and Asia, different countries were running out of different things. So like in the Czech Republic, they ran out of art supplies because the first thought was, how am I going to entertain my kids when they're at home, right? And we were running out of toilet paper. Now, I'm not going to go into the analysis of what that means, but looking at how humans are changing is incredibly important, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But we're going to start with a macro focus, which is we have 5 big revolutions unfolding simultaneously. Each is historic in its own right, but together they're creating an incredible complexity for anyone to deal with emotionally on a day-to-day basis, but also to manage from a business perspective as well. So, there's been a lot of talk around the geopolitical depression. I kind of like to call it the revenge of geopolitics. We used to be in a world where markets influence politics. We're kind of in a world where politics is influencing markets. And, I don't need to tell you, we've got wars on 3 continents. We've got, global military spending climbing for the 9th year to peak levels. The kind of post-World War II framework has shifted massively. And we see geopolitical blocks that are real economic rivals to each other. And that has massive implications in terms of just how we manage day to day, but also for women. This brings me a little bit to the second revolution, which reflects a big shift in economic philosophy and the role of governments in markets. Kind of traditional free market principles have been overtaken more and more by economic nationalism. And so government interventions, if you look at interventions in commerce, if you look at restrictions, if you look at trade policies, are shifting on a day-to-day basis. The world is becoming much more complex. And then the third, obviously, I've heard lots of speakers say we don't want to mention the word AI. Well, we have to talk about AI. It's not just for innovators, right? This is the primary driver of competitive advantage. We expect it to be a huge primary driver of productivity. And when you look across it, it's striking to see that AI infrastructure and access is predominantly in private hands, right? And you look at NVIDIA is estimated to power the majority of AI model training. It has approximately 80% of the GPU market for AI workloads. How that entire transition with AI that we're about to face has also fed into a country competitive aspect and is fueling partially that economic nationalism. But I'm going to leave you with one thought, because I actually used to live in DC when the internet revolution happened. And at that time, where we are now, Google had not yet come to market. So just think about all the players that you know in this space and think about all that they're doing. Today, 98% of the value of search went to Google, right? It wasn't there at this time. So we're very in the early stages of what this means. In terms of the next one, climate, obviously a huge one, big issue. 10 years ago, world leaders gathered in Paris, signed the agreement. Last year was the first year we were over that 1.5 degree. You didn't have to watch California to know that we're not on the right path. This is becoming very visible in a lot of our cities. We're seeing losses from climate skyrocketing. So the gap in insurance is a critical gap in our preparedness. And women have a big role to play here as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then the last one, which we are actually going to spend a lot of time on, is demographics. Our age structures are inverted in the majority of the world. Half of the economies of the world face shrinking workforces. Obviously, that presents a challenge. And we also have an issue in every one of our companies. So we've got 5 generations now in the workforce. Yes, there are a couple of % of the silent generation still in there. And the future workforce is already here. And what they're asking for from their leaders, what they're asking for in terms of training, in terms of how they work, in terms of how they interact, is different than how any of us who are not Gen Z were brought up. And so success requires an understanding of all of these forces simultaneously, because they're compounding. They're moving forward and they're compounding. So I know we spent a little bit more on this, but we're going to dig in pretty quickly. There's quite a few headwinds, but we're going to start with a basic economic equation. Part of my life I spent in Maryland, went to school there, was an economist at one point in time, and so we're going to start with a basic economic equation. Economic growth is driven by population growth, labor force participation growth, and basically productivity growth, how productive our workers are. For the majority of the Industrial Revolution and the majority of our known time, all of our economic growth has been through population growth. The only country that's managed to grow economically through productivity growth on a sustained basis is China. So across all 4, we see a pretty concerning trend. We're in a world where in most regions, population growth has plummeted, unless you're in Africa or in parts of the Middle East. We're getting older. The US median age was 32 from 1990, expected to go to 41 in 2050. Think about what that means in terms of the products and services you're going to see around. And if you can't imagine, look at South Korea, which is facing a huge issue of its own right. And our fertility rates are at 1.6 children per woman, so below sub-replacement level. So that means we're participating less in the workforce, and we've plateaued on productivity. And so even if you assume AI is going to improve our productivity, we have real issues in terms of how do we foster that economic growth on a go-forward basis. And women have a huge role, men as well, but women have a huge role to play here, where we can't, just continue with the status quo. And I think you see on the last one, that was the productivity one. For the first time in three years, global economic growth is expected to hold steady. So it brings real challenges to what we do. So what does this mean? Well, we have to count on women. It's not an if, it's not a do I want, it's not a, this is a nice thing to do that we're going to gather once a year for International Women's Day and we're going to talk about this. We have to count on women as well as men to drive our future economic growth. There's no other way around this equation. So even if we started having more children today, which some folks are recommending, those workers wouldn't be around for another few decades. So what does that mean? We have to solve the imperative for how to get this done, and how do we ensure that we have more women leaders to attract more women into the workforce, because they will not come if we don't have more women leaders. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. On the climate side, I heard somebody talking about elements of this earlier today. Women also have a key role to play. And they also have a key role to play on AI, and they also have a key role to play in geopolitics. These are intertwined issues. Women are more likely to engage with climate change than men. Similar way that they're more likely to engage with philanthropy, whether it's on climate, whether it's through investing in ESG or just considering the environmental impact when purchasing products. And so as share of wallet shifts, as decision-making shifts, we have to have women as part of the solution and contributing to creating the solutions. So what's the issue? Well, we have a lot of barriers to equal participation. And we have barriers to equal participation in the economy. We have barriers to equal participation in politics, which makes it kind of difficult to enable greater access to work and greater access to economic opportunities. I partnered last year with the World Bank and women political leaders. And we kind of took some of the data assets that they had and took some of the data assets that we had and did some analysis to look at, are there any correlations between public sector and private sector? Well, there are. Basically any countries that have higher political representations have higher legal and economic equality. If you don't have political representation, guess what? Those policies, those laws, the enforcement of them will not get done. So if we start with the economic issue and then move it forward and think, how do you actually create change? This was really shocking to me as somebody who's spent multiple decades in the private sector supporting women and making sure we get more women coming up the ladder. We have to do it on the political side as well. It is not enough. Oh, I think we skipped one. But this crisis of labor force participation and employee engagement, it's a gender agnostic issue. I don't want to say that we're only talking about women today. We are, but we have to have men at the table as well. We're seeing an increasing share of workers not only exit out in terms of labor force participation, we're seeing them disengage with their employers, whether it's on how they view their careers or whether they feel optimistic or are they concerned about their future. And now let me ask you, guess how many employees today would prefer an AI manager to a human manager? Raise your hand across 15%. Who thinks it's 15% would prefer an AI manager? No one, okay. 30%? Okay, 40%? Okay, either I've lost all of you because it's the end of the day or something else is happening. 28% for non-Gen Z, 42% of Gen Z would prefer an AI manager to a human manager, right? It's not just AI, we're talking about mass disengagement. And so think about why is that happening? It tells us a lot about the fact that we need to rethink how we work. And it has to change, right? The US labor turnover cost is over $1 trillion annually. We're talking about finding savings here and there. Imagine if we could actually make a difference on this one. So when you think about leadership, what role models come to mind? With all of this backdrop and all of this change, and for those of you that have Gen Z kids, I'm sure you've seen that change at home. Who would say, I don't know, objective decision making? You think that's in the top 5? Ethics? Maybe? All right. Let's see what there is, what's there. So what makes a good leader today? We asked this question, and we saw the top 5 traits from strong communication, objective decision making, emotional intelligence, adaptable to change, and behaves ethically. And you go, well, that kind of makes sense. I could see that, right? But it wasn't always this way. So what's different? If you look across generation and you ask each generation what makes for a good leader, and I'm going to get out of the photos, we're seeing a bit of a leadership revolution across generations. And when I show what changes here, right, strong communications is the universal North Star. It's not a surprise, it's number 3 across generations. It reflects our, I think, hyper-connected era where kind of clarity cuts through complexity and ambiguity. Woe those of us that speak multiple languages and had to adapt to become good communicators, but practice makes perfect. But you look at number 2, and Gen Z places emotional intelligence as their second highest priority, right? I mean, striking departure from other generations where it was number 5. That, I think, signals a demand that they want leaders who understand them. They want leaders who understand the human dimensions of work. They want leaders who understand that it is complex to come to work every day motivated and be hyper-productive in this hyper-connected world that always expects more of us on a yearly basis. And this, I think, on the third one, the generational barometer, the trust barometer, is pretty revealing, right? Boomers build trust on ethical behavior. That's kind of their number 1. Millennials prioritize adaptability. And I think formative experiences at different times, they fundamentally shape leadership expectations. And so what we're looking at and what we're looking for in leaders is shifting. And then objective decision-making, I think, is also a fascinating split. So it's third for millennials. I think they crave data-driven leadership, so maybe that's good for me, given how many data points I'm showing you, but I think that's kind of coming. They came of age during the financial crisis, and what they could measure kind of helped them see where they would go. Gen Z ranks at 6th, so maybe they value purpose more over objectivity. And I think innovative spirit is probably the biggest divide. Top 5 priority for Gen Z, nearly last for boomers. So I think that also values the disruption versus the stability that kind of came at formative times in their lives. So we're gonna play a little bit of an exercise. We're gonna play a guessing game, get our blood flowing. It's just gonna be show of hands, we're gonna do old school. And this is all about perception. So in our global employee surveys, the top 5 leadership traits that you saw there, guess which ones people thought were more demonstrated by women, men, or equally by both. We're gonna start with strong communications. Number 1 trait people value. Show of hands, who thinks people perceive this trait as most frequently demonstrated by men? All right, a little bit less than half the room. Okay, so the answer is that while most picked equally, 34% picked women, 25% picked men. What about objective decision making? How many folks think people perceive this trait as most frequently demonstrated by men? All right, entire room. And if you look, demonstrated equally, but yes, when you look at the split, that is the perception. What about the other ones? Last one, and I'll walk through the other ones quickly. Emotional intelligence. Top 2 leadership trait for Gen Z. Who thinks respondents perceive this trait to be most frequently demonstrated by women? All right, I don't know if I would get the same answer asking a room full of men. You are correct. Massively. So imagine what that means for Gen Z who is in the workforce, continues to enter the workforce, but does not see enough female leaders or female managers, or even just female employees around them. We're gonna walk through the last 2 quickly. Adaptable to change. Yes, demonstrated equally, but when split, skews towards being perceived as demonstrated more by women. And ethical behavior, same. So, 4 out of 5. All right, so when you think about it that way, this exercise was not meant, to say these traits are demonstrated by one or they're demonstrated by another sex. The exercise was really to showcase there's a paradox. We're talking about lacking women's participation at work. We're talking about lacking women in leadership. And yet for the top 5 traits that different generations value, people perceive women on the majority of them as demonstrating them more often. So I'll leave you with that. We're gonna go quickly to fostering women's leadership and what that means. So a few more final talking points here before the next panel really digs into some of the solutions. I mentioned earlier, Gen Z kids are appending our world upside down. I think in a good way on most days. But like, what does that mean at work? Practically, Gen Z and millennials expect to see leaders that reflect them. I don't think this is a surprise. But to them, this is a critical success factors, right? 64% of Gen Z cited seeing their background in key leaders, race, gender, education, sexuality as the most important indicator of their own success. They see that as an indicator of their success. Mentorship, sponsorship, connectivity, et cetera. Less than 50% of boomers said the same thing. The part that was a massive surprise to me is that many of them have already started leaving jobs because they don't feel there's enough gender balance at work. So imagine as more Gen Z enter the workplace, and I think this is particularly prevalent and has a lot of implications for industries where it's been harder to find and retain talent, right? It's an imperative, and this imperative is getting stronger and stronger. So I think that is good hope. And when we look at the number one reason workers are dissatisfied with their leaders and their managers, we see favoritism, biases, lack of diversity and inclusivity, all the way to the top. This data is pretty similar for women and men, right? Like as I talked about earlier, we're solving a broader issue in terms of our economic growth, but I think there is hope and there is an imperative for women in leadership and for women at work that we're starting to see through the generational changes that we hadn't necessarily seen before. Now, we know that companies with diverse workplaces perform better, and they do attract more women in the workplace and women leaders. And I think we need to address this from the first step of the employment ladder all the way up to the top one. So I'm going to leave you with a few thoughts, and I think the next panel is picking up a little bit more in terms of some of the solutioning. When we look at the number, oh, it did not move. Maybe I'm on the wrong slide, but it's not moving anymore. There we go. If we look at the costs of inaction and some solutioning, right? I talked about the missing trillion in America. So that's $1 trillion annual hemorrhage in turnover costs. Just think about what we could do with that, right? I mean, you've seen recently lots of numbers being displayed on where we can cut, but imagine if we could actually save this and deploy it elsewhere. That's a preventable expense, not entirely, but to some extent that I think strategic investment in women's leadership could significantly reduce. And I think there's 4 critical pathways, and I see the panel standing there. So after we get through questions, I hope they're going to pick up some of these. And you know, Victoria and others earlier today talked about some of them. So care work, meaningful support for care work. Number 1, already a huge issue, already a huge disparity. You know, women spend 3 times more of their day on unpaid care than men. In some countries, it's 10 times. And when you look at that and you look at a rapidly aging population, guess what's going to happen? It's not going to be just childcare and a little bit of elder care. It's going to be childcare and a lot of elder care. So 1 in 5 employees today have left jobs due to caregiving responsibilities. That's falling disproportionately on women. When we think back to that labor force participation rate, very hard to move the needle if we don't solve this. And this isn't just a private sector issue, right? If we have to have policies and we have to have support for this more broadly. Creating fair, equitable, and flexible workspaces. It kind of feels like, of course we have to have that. But 62% of women still experience gender biases at work. That does not make it easy. 45% of women exited organizations because of flexibility. And guess what happened during COVID, right? First, many women were in the front line and in service jobs and laws jobs, but then as flexible options came aboard, more women started re-entering the workplace because of those flexible options. Now we've gone backwards, and we're seeing the same shift of women exiting workplaces because they're not finding the flexibility. When you think about AI, and we talked about that as being one of the revolutions, we know 5, 10, up to 50% of a job, depending on the function that you're in, is going to be changed or replaced by AI. So it's a great time to rethink not only how do we do our jobs with AI, how do we improve our productivity as a company, as a country with AI, but also much more specifically, if I have 20% of productivity improvement in my job, does that mean my job can be actually more flexible? Can I think of a flexible solution? Or what if we share a 50% productivity? Can she do 50 and can I do 50 for the period of time when we need more flexible work? People aren't talking about that. They're talking about finding ways to save with the productivity. They're not finding ways to create more flexible workplaces for us as a result of that. The third one is really taking action beyond words. I hope everyone in this room has been a sponsor. It means something different than being a mentor. A mentor is great, but a sponsor means I'm using my political capital to elevate you, or you're using your political capital to elevate me. And that's a big, big difference. About 15% of women believe that gender representation is naturally going to balance out over time. So unless we actually can do something on the action points here, it will not happen. And the last one, redefine the meaning and the possibilities of leadership. Part of why I like to study human trends and I like to study how people are changing, whether it's generationally or through technology or through any of the other influences, is because what my grandmother valued, who fought in World War II, is very different in some ways than what I value. And is very different in other ways than what kids value. And work has changed, right? We are decomposing the kind of hierarchical structures in many ways that came out of a post-World War II military complex. So, I shared on some of the values and what the younger generations want in leadership. Think about what that means and think about how we can all take advantage of that and move us forward in terms of having more women participate in the labor force and future women's leadership. So I know the next panel is going to talk more about that, I hope, so I'm not going to get into this. We heard a lot of speakers today, and I think the questions aren't so much about what we know or the data points that we know, but the commitments. What are we going to do? What are you going to do next quarter or this year? What am I going to do? And then what are all our male allies? Many of you here, thank you, by the way, for being here for the whole day, and those that are not in this room going to commit to and do, because we need many of us to solve this, and we need many of us marching together in the future. Thank you. I think we have 4 minutes for Q&A. So are there any questions? I think you can put them into, okay.
What's an example where women don't have the same legal rights? Or I can't remember what you said at the beginning.
That they don't have the same legal rights, yeah.
What's an example of that?
I mean, equal pay for equal work, the ability to ask for flexibility, security, safety. There's lots that still remain. The World Bank's Women, Business, and the Law publishes this amazing index that looks at 20 plus factors across every single country in the world and basically shows that kind of where we are in comparison. And the US is not as high as I would have expected when I first opened it, so plenty to look at there. Any other questions? I know we have Slido up, but. Oh. Well, I'd like to think that I talked about the key being some of the key ways of empowering women on things that we can do nationally on a corporate basis versus things that we can do personally. I've always been a believer in you can't change what you don't measure. So I believe in transparency, I believe in measuring data, and I believe in moving us along and figuring out and having that accountability in terms of how we move forward. But all of the 4 things that I talked about, unless we fix care, unless we truly focus on sponsorship, unless we truly focus on having flexible workplaces and redefine what we expect from leaders, it's going to be very difficult to empower women as a whole. An example of a woman leader who has inspired me and why. I am not a fan of this question, I got to tell you. And I'll tell you why. Because, I've lived in multiple different continents. I speak 6 languages. I have an accent in every single one at this point. And I think it does a disservice when we just ask for one person. Because I think of 50 women at the same time and I say, wow, so-and-so empowered me because they started 15 years ago, this was Indra Nooy at PepsiCo, talking about how it makes it difficult in the structures that we live in today, when we've lost the ability of having grandparents help us with children, have working women, because it means we have to rely on infrastructure that isn't there in many countries. I don't know, I met Christine Lagarde a few years ago, and she said to me, well, you gotta have the skin of an alligator. Just everything has to just like roll off of you. So the list is like 50. And for me, it's not about there's just one. We all bring different strengths. So whenever I talk to somebody, I think, what am I gonna walk away with and learn in this conversation? And I think, to me, that's a better way of kind of moving forward than saying there's just one. There's lots of many. Company, organization provide innovative solutions in supporting women leaders. I think the best companies that do this are the ones that actually listen and then move forward. I mean, Synchrony, I think, is a great one. I remember meeting your CEO probably 13 years ago now at Women in the World. And guess what? Their table of delegates, all C-suite and executives, all women. I couldn't count that many women at that level in most organizations, 12 to 13 years ago. And so like, they've really, really followed and continued to support each other to do that. And I think if you do that, then you can move forward. I think boomers and Gen Z have a lot to learn from each other. I think they often don't spend enough time together, and especially now. And I'm a little bit worried about the number of boomers that are exiting, because I think we're seeing huge knowledge loss, and no, it is not all in an AI model. So I think finding ways to cross-connect and fostering those, like I've seen coffee chats be incredibly effective. I've seen targeted reverse mentoring programs both ways be incredibly effective. Gen Z's interest in an AI manager with preference for emotional intelligence in leaders. I think we have to remember that AI is available anytime, any place, anywhere. It does not, I don't have to worry about what questions I'm asking it. Yes, I have to worry about some forms of biases, but I don't have to worry about it if I'm asking it a question negatively affecting how that manager thinks of me. So yes, they would prefer emotional intelligence in leaders, but I think if you've looked at the statistics, depending on how you're interacting with AI, in some cases they find them to be more emotionally supportive than humans, which says a lot about humans. So I'm going to try to answer the last one in 50 seconds. Given the demographic trends and the need for flexibility to keep women. That's a great question. I think it's a complex one. So RTO mandates are good and real in some jobs, but not good and real in all jobs. And I think we've seen lots of stories that say that, people in, let's say, some technology jobs had two full-time jobs during COVID, and that because they were remote, nobody could track them and nobody knew, and they were worried about their productivity. And there is a real challenge as well, in the sense that we don't yet know how to train people effectively and pass on the knowledge effectively when we are remote, right? We do apprenticeship really well in person. We don't do apprenticeship really well remotely. So there's a whole host of things that we need to think about, but going one way or the other extremely is not the right answer. Thank you.